had a household that was replete with family pets. My first sentence as a child, actually, my first complete sentence was apparently, "Elion eats flies." My oldest brother had a chameleon, and of course, that was a few too many syllables for me to say. So it came out as, "Elion eats flies." I delighted as a child in getting into his bedroom and sitting by the cage with the chameleon, and he would go outside and catch flies in the summer, put them in the cage, and I would sit there delightfully waiting for the chameleon to gobble up the fly. So we always had family pets. We had dogs. That was in a very interesting era with respect to pets, which I'll touch on later. But my brothers were quite adept at catching animals too. So they managed to catch the neighborhood raccoon, and we had a raccoon pet for a while. This was in the 50s, and it was actually during a period of time when the raccoon rabies had come out of the Appalachian Mountains in Virginia through Maryland and into Pennsylvania. And so there was we recognized later that there was some hazard in this, and so that particular pet only made it as our garage pet for about a week, and then my father demanded that we get rid of it. But the interesting side on that is years later as a veterinary student, it was only then did I learn that during the 50s was when the raccoon rabies source came out of the Appalachians, because they showed a picture of rabies in wildlife, dogs, et cetera, that had been filmed during that period as an educational piece for veterinary students. It was an interesting closure in a loop of personal history and educational history. They also caught crows out of the nest, and we had a crow for a while that they taught to say a couple of simple words. We eventually released that animal too. So we had dogs, and many other animals were in our lives, and that was, I think, very formative in my decision to become a veterinarian. A couple of those animals actually, I was lucky enough to have gone to the veterinarian for very serious illnesses they had and see the veterinarian work on the animals, and I was quite inspired by that. So I don't want to say that secured the deal, but it was in the back of my mind as I entered college, interested in the biological sciences broadly, and then I fell back to veterinary medicine as the most logical choice about midway through my undergraduate.
Tell me, please, about your post-secondary school education, if you will. Start wherever you like.
Well, that was just the greatest time of life. You know, having your primary education and having lived in a hometown, however protective and delightful it might be, and it was. I had good friends. I lived in a good town. I had good associations. I had good affiliations with it. I was very tired of it by the time I was 18. So to be able to leave and pursue something which was much more open-ended and exploratory was really attractive to me. And so I as an undergraduate, I was a decent scholar, but I was quite a good athlete. And I was offered an athletic scholarship at a couple of colleges. I ultimately accepted one of those, but then rejected it because I thought that university was inferior to the University of Michigan, which is where I eventually went without a scholarship. So I was attracted to a really great college town and had a wonderful experience there with, in a course of a sort of a seminal era of change in the United States, 69 to 73. So it was a very active campus with a lot of great intellectual development and social change, and it was a very important time in my life that I'm still fondly reminiscent of. In fact, I cling to it.
Were you involved in or even interested from afar in any of the rights struggles of the 60s? Again, Michigan was a very active campus, and did any of those rights struggles draw you in, or at least, pique your interest in change?
Yeah, they all did, actually. It was an interesting time in that the campus had several closures due to Black Power and Black rights events, and there was a very small contingent of black students on campus, Of course, the University of Michigan has quite a storied history of that with regard to the law school and the undergraduate implications and the legal cases that have borne out of that. But it was for me a very interesting time because I had no perception that they were any different than I was. But you could sense in them as you met them in class and sat by them in chemistry lab and talked with them that they did not feel the freedom of expression and movement that the privileged white classes around them felt. I mean, they really did seem quite strained by it. And it was in others as well. I mean, that was also the era when Chavez was fighting for worker rights in migrant workers on the West Coast, and that had a presence on campus which was very interesting and influenced me. And the other one was the development of the gay rights movement. There were a handful of people that were willing to express their men that I know. I didn't know women actually, but there were some young men that were willing to be open about it, and in a very flamboyant way. And I thought the expression at that level was a bit over the top. But in terms of their access to the freedom of expression and the right to have freedom of expression in that, I stood behind that very strongly. I had a number of gay friends as an undergraduate, and just would not, shy away from admitting that even in that era.
So, as an undergraduate and then later a grad student at University of Michigan, were you a science guy, or did you take a wider variety of courses?
No, I did take a wider variety of courses, but I was pretty much science centric, at least in my talents. In fact, that transition is from, you mentioned about primary education to secondary education. I had applied to several of the Ivies, and the Ivies said, no, you might be eligible for engineering school or architectural school, but your scores are not high enough for you to compete with the literate side of education. So we need to direct you into the science. But I did naturally gravitate towards the sciences. In fact, I had a really formative experience in high school that sort of alerted me to this is the direction I should go. And it's something that I think other scientists would learn from this story. We had on very rare occasions, once or twice a year, we would have a broad assembly where they would bring in a speaker on some topic. And they typically were pretty tedious and boring. But there was, on one occasion in middle school, where they brought in a female botany professor from the University of Pittsburgh. And it was a smaller group. It wasn't a big assembly. It was I think, sort of the advanced science class or biology class. And she spoke to us on a hot, languid spring day. Most people were falling asleep, as was I. But it was really pretty enticing. She just talked about simple experiments with plants, and she was talking about the effects of fertilizer on garden-type plants, perennial-type plants, versus trees. And just pointed out this very simple principle that, you put the same fertilizer that you put on a plant might be suppress the growth of a tree, and what you'd put in a tree might suppress or damage the growth of the plant. And there were a couple of things that really stood out. I mean, it was really my first introduction to somebody really talking about experimentation and the scientific principle. That really stood out. It also really stood out that it was a woman who was talking to us. And the rest of the class, as I say, was sort of dozing off in the beautiful spring day, dreaming of summer just weeks away, the release from school. I definitely felt that in the air, but it was really eye-opening to me and enticing, and I was quite, found it to be a very, a gripping presentation. So I sort of knew science was my forte, it was my academic forte, and particularly mathematics. But so I went to college, headed that direction. I bailed out on some things quite early, like mathematics. I said, it's too easy and I don't know what I can do with it. I need to do something more applied. And so I did more things in biology, and that ultimately evolved to my interest in applying to veterinary medicine. But I was very interested as an undergraduate in those things which are not scientific. I was very interested in anthropology and psychology and English literature and other literature, Polish literature of all things, science fiction. There was a science fiction course that was sort of one to just revel in something delightful and sort of out of the mainstream of academia, self-indulgent. But yeah, that was a very important part of my development. I see that as a very important part of having a rounded life. I mean, I love things in the arts. They're very inspiring.
I know that you pursued a master's in pathology at the University of Michigan, and was that a conscious step to your veterinary study, or was that sort of a way station when you were still determining what path you'd pursue?
No, it's interesting. You list your degrees in the order you require them. That was a master's that was after my veterinary degree. So I was already already had my doctorate. I toyed with the notion, as many have actually done within the field, to become dual boarded or maybe go on and do a PhD in pathology. But I was toying with the idea of not just becoming boarded in the American College of Lab Animal Medicine, but the American College of Veterinary Pathology, because I am very visual in my sense. I love the visual arts, and that's sort of a natural link to pathology, a quick pattern recognition and so forth. And so I toyed with that idea. But ultimately, once I got out and took my first position at MIT after my training, I pretty much concluded that there's so much rich and beautiful in life to learn about, that by going through the sort of regimented and compartmentalized process of acquiring additional degrees, which don't really relate to, I don't need them to be a highly functional person. I already had that tool with simply the DVM degree, and certainly augmented by the specialty training in lab animal medicine. I just decided I'm not going to be able to really operate in all these realms anyway. I'm going to pick one or the other, and there are so many other things to pursue in life. It's just pointless to go further. But I am really happy that I completed a master's, and I did teach the medical students at a couple of different of my academic positions pathology. So I did use it as a teaching tool and an entry into that educational side of things.
So tell me about vet school at Penn, where you got your VMD, and what introduction in particular you had to research and to lab animal research.
The roots of that actually they predated Penn in a sense. I was sort of fascinated as an undergraduate sitting in biology 101 or zoology 101. That course was taught not by one or two professors. It was taught by the diversity of the faculty in biology. And some professors were better than others, and some could really light up the class with their they're just sort of electrifying people and would do interesting things. So one in particular, on a couple of occasions, and the class was set in like almost a 19th century amphitheater. The wooden chairs were very reminiscent of the 20s and the 30s. It was sort of dark in there, and the professors down there on the podium, doing the lecturing. So Dr. Kleinsmith oftentimes would come out and do clever things. And frequently he would walk behind the podium back where it linked into the laboratory area and bring an animal out. So one day he marched a goat out onto the stage with him and did some clever little thing for 5 minutes just to sort of catch our attention. And did something that on a couple of occasions. And I wondered, when he did that, who cares? Where do the animals come from? Who is caring for these animals? And actually, the one thing that really made me connect it directly to veterinary medicine is that he did this on one occasion when I was coming down in the flu and sitting in the class. And I was, I was beginning to get very stuffy. I was getting a headache and a low-grade fever. And, you didn't want to miss any classes because if you miss a class, that might have repercussions for what you do or don't do in tests and the whole competitive idea of academia. And I honestly thought, if I'm sitting in the class becoming sick and bearing with it, who takes care of the animals when they're getting sick? And so that was sort of an interesting connection to what I later pursued in laboratory animal medicine. But as I went to Penn, it was very interesting because there was no presence or minimal presence of laboratory animal medicine and laboratory animal veterinarians within the veterinary school. And there was actually, I think, minimal presence within the whole campus, the University of Pennsylvania campus at that point. And the philosophy within the veterinary school was that this notion of comparative medicine is silly. We don't need to talk about it as comparative medicine because it's redundant. Veterinarians are veterinarians for all animals. They already are comparative in their approach. So don't add the redundancy. But in fact, they really did neglect, the majority of species. I mean, you can only be taught on several animals in veterinary school. You can cut the small domestic animals, the large domestic animals, the horse and the cow, the pig, and the couple of companion animals. And then in that era, they threw in some lectures on zoo animals and some of the exotics and so forth that were becoming commonly seen in practice. But, think of the breadth of the animal kingdom and then remember that within the laboratory animal community, they were taught only minimally in veterinary school. So having had this undergraduate experience that I talked to you about, as a freshman, I went and I said, why is there no presence or education on any of the laboratory animals? And they were using laboratory animals as part of our didactic course. They were using guinea pigs and rats to demonstrate peristalsis in living tissue and, the classical physiological labs that were taught in that era in medical schools and dental schools under conditions that frankly weren't quite that stellar in my interpretation. So I went and asked the dean of students, why there was such a lack of focus on the comparative aspects in these other species, and was basically told that the impression of the school was, that comparative medicine is it's lab animal medicine, comparative medicine, or a redundancy, and you'll be able to do those as a veterinarian. So as I finished my first year, I figured, well, what am I going to do in terms of my summer employment to prepare to be a better second-year student? And I was sort of unique among my classmates, in that one of the things that they pushed very hard on during the interview process what has your actual experience been working with veterinarians? And my answer to that was, I've had none, because I really did two things as a university student. I was a collegiate athlete, which took 4 hours a day every day, year round, and I was a student and a good student. And I don't need to demonstrate through working in a practice. I think I can extrapolate from my own personal experiences in life to do this. So I was able to apply for veterinary school after my third year as an undergraduate. And they told me that, I was told during the interview that I was a very fine student. They felt I was a very top candidate, but it would be wise for me to go and spend the summer and get more experience in an actual veterinary practice so that I'd be competitive with the other students. And so the year passed, and that summer between my junior and senior year of college, I did not do that because I was a competitive athlete and I was hopeful of making the Pan American Games and blah, blah, blah. So I went and trained, and I was then called back the next year and, of course, got an interview again at Penn, and was being interviewed by not just two professors this time, but it seemed like 3 or 4. And they posed that very hard question, and I told them that the same answer essentially that I told them the year before, that not only I invested a lot of my personal life pursuing the athletic piece of this, but after having pursued 8 years of my life in a community of people that I felt very strongly about. I was not about to give that up to simply fulfill what they felt was an essential requirement. And if I was rejected from their application this time, I would use my connections in the state of Michigan. I would go to Michigan State University and do a master's in the animal sciences department to do some additional courses that are directly relevant and work with the veterinarians there, and then come back and apply again. Or I would apply in the state of Michigan as a resident of Michigan. Because at that point, the veterinary schools really recruited only in the state you were from. I was a Pennsylvanian by birth, and so Penn was my school. Anyway, they accepted my explanation and accepted me as a veterinary student. Well, back to now the extended story of how did lab animal medicine fit into this. I decided that I wanted to try to find those veterinarians who care for the sick animals that might occur within the teaching programs of a university. And I recognized that medical schools must be using a huge number of animals in research. I mean, we use them as undergraduates in teaching classes. Many of the principles that we learned about in the advanced zoology classes, physiology, comparative medicine, anatomy, etc., comparative physiology, it was clear all the things were being illustrated in animal models, and I figured that places like the University of Michigan must have veterinarians that are involved in this. So I wrote a letter to, I didn't have names, I just wrote it to the university veterinarians, hoping it would get there. And lo and behold, it got to Dr. Ben Cohen, who really is perceived in the United States as the founder of laboratory animal medicine. He was the director of that program and had established the first laboratory animal veterinary training program for lab animal veterinarians in the United States at the University of Michigan back in the 60s. So I went, based on my letter to Dr. Cohen, he at that time had, I think, written to they had an NIH grant to train postdoctoral trainees in laboratory animal medicine. But using this letter, he wrote a letter, I think, to his grants officer and said, I have a veterinary student that is interested in spending a summer in the program to develop an interest in, to learn about the use of animals in research. And that stimulated the NIH funding summer fellowships for veterinary students. So I spent the summer in that program and had a really great experience. And I ultimately went back and trained in that program as a postdoc. But then in the second year of veterinary school, I went back to Penn after that experience, and I told them that they were fantasizing if they thought that veterinary school was going to do justice to this very important group of animals and the use of animals in science with the current approach they were taking. And they didn't really heed the advice too much with augmentation of courses, but they did get some tapes for students to review to learn more about lab animals. And then the summer following that, I thought that was a very positive experience. I think I'll sample another program in lab animal medicine. So the Penn State University at Hershey also had one of the established postdoctoral training programs for lab animal veterinarians. And I went there as a second year veterinary student and spent the summer in that program. So I had two very significant exposures to laboratory animal medicine during my veterinary years. And then ultimately I went back to pursue that after a one-year voyage into agricultural veterinary medicine after I graduated. I don't even recall a single lecture on veterinary medical ethics. So that's something which evolved later. So I was a veterinary student from 1973 to 1977. And just as I was leaving, I believe, in the years when I was I was a student member of the AVMA, and I was receiving the Journal of American Veterinary Medical Association during that time. I think it was late in that student year where maybe Bernie Rawlins' first entry into that journal appeared. And I may be missing that by a few years. He may have been even later than that. So yeah, there was not much organized in that regard.
At what point in your veterinary education did you begin doing surgery on animals?
That was as part of the well, it was part of the course curriculum, with the exception that the summer I spent, even as a freshman in veterinary school, the summer I spent in the lab animal training program, I was not doing surgery, but I was an assistant in some surgical procedures where the veterinary residents were doing surgeries for investigators, and they asked whether I would be willing to assist. So I learned to gown up, glove, hand instruments in a quick and timely way during both of those summer programs. But I myself did not put a single suture in an animal nor make a single incision. So that really wasn't until the third year of veterinary school where we participated in the dog surgical training labs, which were something that were sort of disconcerting to us even as students in those days, and very easy to understand why they did not endure in that form and why they have faded over time in general. Well, yeah, so as students, we were taught the basics, the didactics of postoperative care, and understood the basics of fluid therapy and so forth. But by today's standards, even by those standards which evolved as you got into more advanced education and a couple of years out of school and started looking and deriving things out of animal models in the human literature, you realize how superficial your education is. So we basically had these very superficial tools. We were thrown into not just doing the surgery on the animals with the professors rotating around the room and giving us tips as we work, but then we are supposed to recover the animals and do the post-operative care on the animals, and it, you know, they just were very poor conditions. I mean, animals were put back into their home cages. There were no provisions for the comfort of the animals, and minimal provisions for what we would consider acceptable post-operative care by today's standards, or even by the standards that prevailed a decade after that.
More specifically, was either anesthesia or analgesia, um, was the administration of either common, or were they in their earlier nascent stages in veterinary medicine at that?
Well, with regard to anesthesia, I think the anesthesia was quite satisfactory. That was sort of a transition in veterinary medicine. Within the decade prior to that, it was very common and still quite prevalent in veterinary practices, even to the point when I was in veterinary school and probably going a decade later, where many of the veterinary practices that had people trained earlier were still using solely injectable anesthetics. But in veterinary school, we, of course, were taught to use gas anesthesia. So we were really using state-of-the-art anesthesia in the surgeries. But the postoperative pain relief, I think the whole notion of that was terribly skewed as in terms of the veterinary education at that point. There was some discussion about postoperative pain relief in severely impaired animals, but for the most part, for common things, for example, anything within the abdominal cavity, generally it was regarded as, well, sure, there's some incisional pain, but that helps protect the animal and help the recovery of the animal, so they don't bother the incision line. And so intra-abdominal procedures, spays being among the most trivial, and then a whole array of things being well beyond that, were never afforded post-operative analgesics. And that was, I would say that was true through that first 5 or 6 years after my graduation. That was sort of the prevailing view. And then the very interesting things happened. That was the development of additional drugs, which had less of an abuse potential than morphine. And I honestly think that one of the impediments during the era when I was in veterinary school was simply that you didn't have many options. You had some NSAIDs, phenylbutazone, and you had the big guns in the opioids. You had morphine, apomorphine, and pentazocine, which is it's in the narcotic family. So in order to use those, and of those, clearly the best for pain relief was morphine. And people recognized that dealing with morphine, having morphine in your practice, that there were hazards with that, and it was associated with, morphine is, we associate it with people who have terminal illness or, massive battle injury. I mean, you associate it with really massive pain. And I know from during that era, also having my father pass away and seeing my father go through very serious surgery, that even in the human postoperative recovery area, they were not very attuned to pain. So I think there were parallels in many arenas in that regard. But anyway, within 5 years, some of the other narcotics came out with less abuse potential, and people began to appreciate more and more of the importance of providing postoperative pain. And honestly, I think we can say proudly that penetrated the lab animal sector at least as quickly and in parallel with what it did in, say, the companion animal sector. And that's only improved with time, because better and better drugs have been developed, both in the NSAID family and other classes of drugs, and the opioids have been developed. So that's really been a very gratifying thing to witness over the course of 30 to 40-year career that I have in veterinary medicine. The laboratory animal community and the research community has been really very attentive to the use of analgesics and anesthetics and tranquilizers. I think some investigators, and they believe based on their science, are reluctant to use them. And I think in some cases there are scientists that still have misconceptions and ill-conceived notions where maybe in their institution the institution is not pushing hard enough in particular tiny niches. But I think as a generalization that both the scientific community and the veterinary community and the committees, which may not actually be the science users or the veterinarians, the people who are the unaffiliated members of the committees, the outside members of the committees, I think there's an active enough discussion of that issue that things are generally very, very good. Now, there's a lot of hair splitting that can go on, and I think should go on, and that is, it relates to the term adequate veterinary care versus what I was always a proponent for, which is really contemporary veterinary care. In fact, one of the earliest conferences, one of the earliest OPRR conferences that they held to in the rollout of the adoption of the PHS policy, they began holding conferences around the country to discuss what are the key issues within the guide and how are we going to make our programs compliant. So I, at the time, was at MIT, and I was asked to speak on the topic of adequate veterinary care. And I made the point in my talk that it should not be. We should not be striving for adequate veterinary care. We should be striving for contemporary veterinary care, because we as veterinarians who are representing institutions go out among other veterinarians who are skeptical of what we do, because they don't. First of all, they haven't been taught to understand the research principles and the importance of research. They look at the veterinarians who enter the research side of things as second-class citizens, because they've obviously abdicated any shred of love they might have had for animals before, because they're working at a capacity where the animals are used scientifically and then euthanized. It's just anathema to what veterinarians do. We make animals live. We don't use animals in a process which consumes them. So if an institution is going to expect us to stand up and talk to the broad veterinary community and the public veterinary community, we shouldn't be using a term like adequate veterinary care. We ought to be reminding people that we do veterinary care exactly at the level that the best veterinary medical hospitals do them. So within that rubric of contemporary veterinary medical care, that really brings us back to, I think, where some of the sticking points continue to be in institutions. And because as things are discussed in committee, the scientists will propose a a drug which maybe they have a history of using in the lab, or which maybe was a very good drug 10 years ago and brought to them by at the direction of a veterinarian or a conference within the past 5 or 10 years. But if the latest and greatest comes down the pike 5 years later, and now there's a new drug, and a veterinary, and if the veterinarian has an interest in promoting again to what would be considered contemporary veterinary care, and asking the investigator to again shift and change the baseline framework for their work, that can become a contentious issue. And the problems, and so I think in many institutions there can be problems when veterinarians are overly strident about asking for drug substitutions that have a benefit for the animal, but maybe not a sufficient increment in benefit that it really warrants tearing the whole fabric of the organization apart to make the point about where veterinary medicine is now versus where otherwise very good care is for the animal. So to consistently be pushing for the frontier can be a very consuming process that's counterproductive, and it really ruins the cooperative spirit in programs which are otherwise functioning very well, and really where there is a very high interest in doing the right thing for animals.
You have had one of the most varied and certainly one of the most illustrious careers in lab animal medicine. So I'd like to hear about each of the institutions at which you've worked. And in particular, I'd like you to address 3 issues at each. One is ethical issues that were discussed and to what extent, or at least in what context. 2, I'd like to hear about your experience with or exposure to IACUCs and the committees. And finally, I'd like to hear about your observations on lab animal medicine and humane care and use as those practices evolved during the course of your career. So let's start with the University of Michigan, please.
Well, so as I mentioned, my lab animal training began at the University of Michigan, but training in a sense really was a first job because we were asked as the postdocs and residents to get out there and do it right from the get-go. And the University of Michigan was quite unique in that they had made a stand. The veterinarians had made a stand at Michigan. They were asked on an annual basis to sign off on the USDA report attesting to the fact that the animals in the institution are used appropriately with regard to anesthesia, analgesia, tranquilization, and the relief of pain and suffering in the animals. And in order to sign off on that form conscionably, Ben Cohen went to the faculty and said, the faculty senate, and said, if we're going to do this, we really need some shred of evidence to say that it's actually happening the way we think it's happening. And there was no tool for that because this was 1979 and this was prior to institutional animal care and use committees. So as a result of that, the University of Michigan was able to adopt the first protocol review form, which is a two-page form with about 15 very simple questions that did not delve very deeply into things. It was merely the skeleton high points of how and what the animals were going to be used for. And when that was submitted, then the investigators were allowed to order the animals. But it was really very superficial, as I say. And the forms went to the faculty only after they had gone through us as the postdoctoral scholars to go through the form, to look at all the pieces, were all the boxes checked off, and was the information there. And did we have any questions about what was there, and would we like to advise or work with the investigators to improve their approaches? Now there was no real leverage to get them to change their approaches. So we had to do it by powers of persuasion based on what we could find in the literature, and force of personality. Can we cajole them or sweet talk them? Or can we show them some evidence that they believe that will help them? And it was really based on that we were able to make changes in a percentage of cases, but not all cases. And I'd say actually a disappointing percentage of cases. But we could at least assure there was anesthesia there. Getting back to my earlier theme, we couldn't assure that the approach was in concordance with contemporary. practices, but we could assure that there was at least some practice there. So as I said, there was no committee, and that really did create a problem. I mean, recognizing that if you find things which are unacceptable, and in that era there were many things which were unacceptable, it's an affront to somebody to say you're performing inhumane care, and that inhumane care reflects on your ethical position. But needless to say, there were certain times when we did that, particularly as postdoctoral scholars. Perhaps we weren't cultivated enough in the ways of the institution. The way we did it perhaps was offensive. But there were certainly numerous occasions where ethical things came up in animals, and where there was an inability for us to get resolution with those on those instances with the investigators in terms of the standard approach they were using, because the professors really had the control and the power. So it was interesting, and actually, I think, built a skill set which I was able to use in other institutions. We would talk about these when we convened our veterinary rounds meetings, which we did on every Friday. And among the veterinarians, Ben Cohen often would make the point that you just need to do this by becoming their colleague. If you're their colleague, if you speak to them respectfully, if you use your powers of persuasion, you'll be able to you'll be able to achieve an outcome which is acceptable. And he often made the point that you can accomplish more oftentimes at a Christmas party or cocktail party or happy hour than you can by barging into the laboratory and saying an inflammatory, albeit correct, observations about individuals. And I think that played very well in terms of my own personal development, because I had a history in many other great research institutions, which I'll talk about soon. And you're still confronted, even when you have the leverage of a system of oversight, you're still confronted with the real politic that people are people, and personality is really important, and communication and personality skills are really important in achieving an outcome that's satisfactory for everyone and face-saving when it needs to be face-saving. So ethical issues were not directly attended to. There was no public discussion in a broad sense of ethics at the faculty level, but there certainly was a lot of niche discussion of ethics with individuals at the University of Michigan. And but they did develop a protocol review form in advance of when they were required to do that, and that did become a tool in bridge building, because it did force the relationship between the veterinarian and the scientist on critical issues. So it forced that contact and helped the infiltration of thinking both directions, really. So following in Michigan, I took my first position then at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology, and that would be 1981. So we're still prior to the implementation of IACUCs in a formal way. But MIT had already developed an institutional animal care and use committee in anticipation of that, and the committee was a well-formed faculty committee. And they were operating, actually it began as a committee which was more interested in the nuts and bolts of running the organization in a way that was financially responsible and got them the animals when they need them. So it was much more of a users group committee. But as I went there, it was beginning to morph, seeing what was coming down the pike, it was beginning to morph more into the ethical dimension and the review of the research. And my boss and mentor there, Jim Fox, said, Chris, you're really the one that's in the trenches now, working with the investigators as the clinical veterinarian and so forth. And I want you to be the representative on this committee. So I was the veterinary representative on the MIT committee. And that committee began the formal process of protocol review and began to amplify that with protocol revisions as the Animal Welfare Act revisions rolled out and the Health Improvement, the Health Research Extension Act rolled out in 85 and 86. We began to change and modify the form. And as we began to talk as a committee, again, it was still a fairly science-centric in its focus. But MIT had quite a few, unique scientists, and I think maybe unlike other organizations, was more attuned to listening to the ethical themes, and they were quite receptive. I mean, they listened very carefully to my. I felt they listened very carefully to my observations as a veterinarian, and the committee chair of the IACUC at MIT was a physician, and he was a very compassionate person, very interested in protecting the institution and making sure we do the right thing. And he was very good about supporting the observations that I had and making sure that we got very good answers to questions and controversies, and had the work conducted in a way that was satisfactory. And this was really, again, there wasn't much discussion of ethics as an independent topic at MIT either in the era that I was there. I mean, ethical themes began to come up because Primer had already started at that point. It started in in that time frame a few years after I was at MIT. So the ethical, and folks from the MIT program, myself included, of course, were going to the Primer meeting, and the ethical discussions began to be more openly spoken about. But it wasn't really until then that I went to Tufts, where there was more of a proactive discussion of the issue of ethics, and that's because the dean there, Frank Lowe, was such a proponent of ethics, and Andrew Rowan was running the Tufts Center for Animal Welfare. I think I have that name correct, I forget. And both were very active, and of course my committee members as the new director at Tufts included my interviewer, Joan Racklin, and Dr. Andrew Rowan. So we had a very interesting IACUC there, where we certainly had active discussion of ethics within that committee. We had a number of things that we had to confront too, as from the ethical standpoint. But even outside the confines of the committee, the institution was beginning to sponsor, by virtue of the Center Center for Animals, it was beginning to sponsor independent discussions of ethical issues, and it was a rich environment for those discussions, and I think it really let us promote what we're beginning to see now more as the evolving standards of care of research animals. Well, when the improved standards for laboratory animals and the Health Research Extension Acts were passed, I was at MIT, and I think actually the passage there had less impact in that institution than it did generally across the spectrum of things that I had seen within the course of my time doing biomedical research, because actually, as I have already mentioned, I spent time as a summer fellow in research programs. After I finished veterinary school, I actually did a large animal internship at the Penn State University. And my position there was a 50% of the time working in the state diagnostic lab doing pathology disease diagnosis on large animals. And the other half of the day was the junior herd clinician, taking care of the university's herds. But the actual title I had was not intern or clinical veterinarian. I actually been hired under the university title research assistant. And the implications of that were that as part of being the research assistant, I was really the agricultural laboratory animal veterinarian for professors in the agricultural sciences that were doing research studies in large animals. And so not only did I see animals used before the regulations changed, I saw agricultural animals used before there was even any thought of including them in the regulations, because they were agricultural animals being used for the purpose of agricultural research, and that, of course, was one of the carve-outs in the regulations. So, so I have this whole history where I saw things in classic laboratory animals and agricultural research animals where there was no oversight of the research. The power was in the hands of the investigator. The planning had no it may have had peer review. I suspect minimal in many cases, because whatever was in the mind of the investigator was a priori satisfactory. I mean, the idea of academic independence and privilege could not be challenged. And so some institutions, as I mentioned, started to eat away at that. But MIT, I think, had already established and was sort of a unique place that maybe softened the impact of, softened the expression of what the true impact of that was. And I think part of that is because MIT was a very molecularly oriented institution. They had a number of prestigious biological scientists working in small animal models and working in the early stages of understanding the mechanisms. How do things work at a molecular level? They were engineers. They were very molecularly oriented, and they had come through a history in their 60s where perhaps their program was in disarray. I don't really know. But I do know that when they made the decision to bring Jim Fox to the institution as a veterinarian, there was a very senior level commitment at MIT, and they said, this guy is the veterinarian. Everyone else I think they had a personal impression that we're just a bunch of engine heads. If the vet tells us that we should do it this way, we're going to listen to him. And so, and Jim had a very strong program and very strong support. And I think he was able to just get people to come to him because he demonstrated that with the support that he had, that when people came to him, he could develop a way to solve their problem and actually help them in research. So they were very appreciative of what the veterinarians could do, even when there was some pushback on cases. You didn't see the direct change in the context of that institution. And I think the other piece that really played an important role was that was not a medical school environment. I think in the medical school environments, especially the major research institutions like the ones I spent my time in, these were big powerhouses of research, and they would have important people in every department, and those people typically had national and international prestige. And to try to take them on was just a very hard thing, particularly in the days when there was no ability to do that. So when the Animal Welfare Act was revised and the PHS policy was adopted and fortified, finally there was the leverage of a committee to say, we as an institution have this obligation embodied in this committee, and this committee is going to make a judgment. And then the battle became, are the committees malleable enough to the interests of researchers? That's a battle which still plays out today on the tail end of the bell curve. But in that era, of course, we were sort of at the fat of the bell curve. There were a majority of institutions, or many institutions, probably 50% of the institutions. It was a battle that the scientists still, in a sense, were winning, because they said, okay, we're going to do this, but we're going to do it in a very pro forma. We're going to stonewall it, basically. And so I think we ought to be right up front here and credit Primer with the war of attrition on the stonewalling of attitude, that because you are appointed as an academic and recognized as a top academic, that doesn't necessarily validate every idea you have, and it certainly doesn't validate the way in which you intend to play out your scientific ideas in a living animal creature. So that's something that really we want to credit Primer for achieving. So I then was attracted to leave MIT because I was there for 6 years, and I just felt it was time for me to run my own program. I felt I had achieved enough personal development and maturity that I was willing to stand up and fight the battles directly. And that's sort of what led me to take the position at Tufts University. And actually, Frank Lowe had asked me 3 years before I actually took it. He had asked me just 3 years out of my training to come and interview for the directorship over there. And I went over and looked at the program one afternoon and saw some of the conditions and talked to a couple of people. And I told Frank that I wasn't quite ready to enter hypermaturity at that point in my life and take this battle on. So 3 years more incubation at MIT, and the opportunity came up again, and I decided to go back and interview for the position at Tufts. And there were some significant challenges at Tufts. It was a medical school environment. It was also administratively complex, in that there were I reported not to one institutional official but 3 institutional officials, because the institution I was paid by was called Tufts-New England Medical Center, reflecting that it was a collaborative effort between Tufts University Medical Center, Health Sciences campus on the one side and the New England Medical Center on the other side. And they had somewhat distinct personalities leading those organizations, and they had somewhat different ideas about resource allocation. And but yet the program that they had was a collaborative program, a glove-in-hand kind of collaborative program, but at times it was reminiscent of the O.J. Simpson trial. If the glove doesn't fit, you've got to, acquit. So the glove in hand did not always work well, and I was in the position as the director of the program to try to develop the cooperative spirit between these 2 groups. And that was a very interesting challenge, and I couldn't have done it if I didn't have the support of what was then, I think, a highly functional IACUC committee for that period in time. Now, that committee was not well developed and would not be a committee. It would be considered well run by today's standards, because the committee the committee had a chair, but actually the chair and a process independent of myself was not doing the writing and correspondence for the committee. For the most part, the individual who worked did the clerical work for the committee was a member of my organization, and I was essentially the ghostwriter for the committee. And it was curious also in that, as the attending veterinarian with a great conflict of interest, I had to review my own program, and I had to then criticize my own program in the biannual reviews that were submitted to the institutional official. And that's now regarded as a classic conflict of interest. But to be very honest, I think I was pretty tough on myself, and I used that as a tool to the institutional officials to try to do things to improve the program. But it's an approach that would not be acceptable today. But really, within the context of that era, it worked fairly well. The other problem with it was that although the committee supported things which went the language and the content of letters, pretty much, I was regarded as, and I was known and regarded as the ghostwriter for the committee. And so a lot of investigators would refer to the actions of the committee as my personal actions. Obviously this letter is reflecting, Dr. Newcomer's personal view and something Dr. Newcomer wants us to do. And he's standing in the way of science by doing this. That was not a preponderant view of many of the investigators, but there were a few highly regarded individuals who like to stress that point. And then that made things a little more difficult for me on the operational side, and really it diminished my stature as a scholarly equal, or being received in a scholarly way by a subset of people at the institution. That was, again, not a universal impression, but it was an impediment, I think, to the development. But I must say that we certainly were able to push ethical discussion within that committee very satisfactorily, and made a lot of progress at Tufts University as a result of that. So I spent close to 7 years at Tufts, and I felt I had done what I could do there, and that was sort of, I was limited by the resources available, and I was limited by I think the authority that I'd been given for various components of the program. And I'll mention one to be very frank about it, and that is I felt very uncomfortable still with the lack of adoption of contemporary veterinary practices within the Department of Surgery facility. The surgery facility at that time within the medical school was run by the Department of Surgery. There was, and not by me. I felt that if that facility, and that facility served as a resource for the whole institution. So people would go through the protocol review process, and they would say they're going to do surgery in the surgery facility run by the Department of Surgery under the care and guidance of that staff, and I felt that staff was using practices which were adequate, but certainly not contemporary, and that became one of the issues that I really was sort of attracted me to look at other positions. That and the fact that I just felt it was time to take on bigger challenges. So I looked at several other positions, and I took the directorship at the University of North Carolina.